Tonight we continue our study of the book of Isaiah, and we really, in a lot of ways, have already covered the theme, right? There's really it's a long book, right? 66 chapters in it, and there's a lot of things in it, but there's really very limited messaging in it, if you will. There's basically God's bringing what? Judgment, right? God's bringing judgment, and He's bringing it to whom specifically? Judah, right? That's Isaiah, but He's also going to mention Israel. He's going to eventually mention Syria and a whole bunch of other nations. There's lots of judgment in the book that's coming from God. With that judgment, generally there is always a small remnant, right? And then ultimately there's the messaging that ultimate promise and hope is fulfilled in who? Jesus, and He is coming. And that's it, right? That's really, and I'm not trying to oversimplify the book, but that's really the message of the book. That God has some immediate judgment against some nations and people that He needs to address. He's going to use some interesting ways to do that. There's going to be a remnant to survive that, and that ultimately the greatest promises that God offers to that remnant is Jesus is coming. That there's a great promise of a great prophet that is coming in the future. So with that said, I think we're going to be able to move more swiftly now through the narrative, because we've basically got the basic principles of the book into our minds already. And there'll be some details that we'll pick up along the way, but I'm going to carve large swaths out of the book now, that we've got the basic understanding of how the book operates and works. And I'll pause here and there on some main themes that come up within the various chapters. But I've already kind of not been reading through the chapters, and I'm really going to start taking much bigger chunks as we look at it. And so be prepared for that. In your readings, at home prior to class, you might want to start reading 3, 4, 5 chapters at a time, not the typical 3, 4, 5 verses at a time that we are known for sometimes in our study. So let's get into chapter 9 together this evening, because basically at the beginning of chapter 9, the first 7 verses, he basically, in your outline that I shared with you, that's a study guide help, mentions this as well, that there are better days coming, right? It's going to be awful and horrible, and there's going to be challenges that they're going to have to deal with for a period of time. But ultimately, there are better days that are on the horizon. And so notice verses 6 and 7 of chapter 9. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. And that sounds exactly like what? Yeah, it is Jesus, and it sounds just like what text? Luke chapter 1, right? It's exactly what that recording of Luke gives us as it relates to the birth of Jesus in Luke chapter 1. It's the same thing. What Luke does for us is a great service, right? Because when he gives us this exact kind of verbatim quotation from Isaiah, it helps us connect the two together. It helps us to appreciate that if we don't just have Isaiah telling us about somebody is coming and giving us somewhat some understandings about when that's going to occur, but what Luke does is he says, Jesus, who I'm talking about, that's the one Isaiah was talking about. The one that would be born and serve in these purposes as the wise counselor and the Prince of Peace and the King of Kings and all of that descriptiveness, he says, that's Jesus. That's the one that's being born as contemporaries to us, as Luke records his messaging. It's interesting. He mentions, Isaiah does, that this great coming blessing that would happen in this one that was coming would happen in Zebulun and Naphtali. Who are they, by the way? I'm not trying to insult you here. I'm just trying to refresh your memories. Yeah, they're part of the 12 tribes. We don't usually reference them, right? Don't hear a lot about them. But they are part of those 12 tribes, and they're basically to where? trying to give it to you. Up to the north. In fact, in New Testament times, that's known as Galilee. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 15, by the way, just to give you a reference to that, and that may have been in your outlines as well, but Matthew 4, verse 15 specifically identifies that for us, that Zebulun and Naphtali were the equivalent of New Testament times Galilee. Where did Jesus spend the bulk of his time while he was on earth? In Galilee, right? Our minds, if you asked it fast, you might think where? Jerusalem, right? You might think Jerusalem, because that would be kind of the natural inclination of one who was going to be born into this Jewish heritage, and one that had been promised to come through the Jewish lineage. All of that would make you almost think that Jesus was going to spend a whole lot of time in Jerusalem. But he doesn't. The bulk of his preaching and ministry and teaching and even his miracles happen in and around the Sea of Galilee. Why do you think he didn't spend a lot of time in Jerusalem, by the way? Okay, part of it because that's the region he was from. It was where he was most familiar in terms of geography and places he could travel to and be. That's going to be part of that equation. Jesus also speaks a little bit about what would happen if he went to Jerusalem too often. Yeah, there's no place for him there. There's no place for him there. And ultimately, what did the Jews keep trying to do every time they found him? They tried to kill him, right? And he knew that if he prematurely arrives in Jerusalem with too much fanfare, then they may try to hasten that process and the fullness of time hadn't been fulfilled. And so there were times, right, when Jesus starts performing his miracles, his disciples were like, let's get where? Yeah, let's get to Jerusalem. They got to see this. We got to get down to Jerusalem and show them your power. They got to see this. And Jesus is like, it's not time for me to get down there yet. And he would sneak down privately at times, and he would hide away from the multitudes for a period of time. All of that, rarely events happening in Jerusalem, mostly around Galilee and the work and ministry. So it's not uncommon or unusual then that the prophet Isaiah, when he referenced this coming blessing of Jesus, said he would do his work in and around Galilee. In verses 8 through 11 of Isaiah 9, if you look at that, he turns his attention, by the way, to the northern kingdom for a little bit. And I think when he uses and references Israel in this moment, I think he's specifically referencing things. It's hard sometimes, right? Because sometimes Israel means all of them, all the Israelites, and sometimes it means just those 10 tribes, those northern tribes that split off during the divided kingdom period. I think that's who he's referencing in those verses. And he basically tells them, listen, their punishment came because they refused to repent. They refused to even think for a moment that they had any accountability to God and that they should turn away from their sins and their difficulties. Look at verse 10 of chapter 9. The bricks are fallen down, but what? We will build with hewn stones. The sycamores are cut down, but we will change them into cedars. Therefore the Lord shall set up the adversaries of Rezin against him and join his enemies together. Every time God tried to humble them, what'd they say? Yeah, we'll figure it out, right? We lose the bricks, we'll build up with some hewn stones. We'll cut some rock, it'll be fine. Don't have any sycamores left to build with. It's fine. We'll go get some cedar. They continually refused to be humbled by the things that God was doing in order to try to get them to be penitent. And every time they felt like they were so self-reliant and so proud that nothing could stop them. You tear it down, we'll build it again. And eventually he says, I'm going to use Syria, I'm going to use Rezin, king, and I'm just going to come in and deal with Israel and bring the consequence that I promised to them. Pride gets in the way of repentance, by the way, all the time. It in so many ways, is the great stumbling block to the penitence that all of us need to have in our lives sometimes. It's not just an Israel issue. It's an all of us issue. And you think about the times where we need to stand corrected and need to make some changes. But that pride pride kicks in. I think, well, I'll make some adjustments later, or I'll think about that differently later, or we rationalize away our responsibilities. And that was going on in Israel, and it was creating difficulties for them.
They think they know more than God does.
And that was part of their mindset. Yeah. From top down, they were having issues, right? And it created more and more difficulties to the point where God finally says, I'm just going to have to bring a judgment against them. Notice verse 13. For the people turneth not unto him that smiteth them, neither do they seek the Lord of hosts. Therefore the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and rush in one day. They've had opportunities to repent. They've rejected those opportunities. And because of that and that pride, I'll just come in, and in one moment they think, I will just build that up again. We'll cut down some cedars, and we've ran out of sycamore. We'll just cut down some cedars. It'll be fine. We'll take care of it. And ultimately God says, I'll just come in and take it all. And they'll be gone. And it's interesting, at the end of the chapter, in verse 21, he says, Manasseh, Ephraim, Manasseh, and they together shall be against Judah. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. And I think really what he's trying to say there is that they'll, within Israel, they'll just devour one another too. Ephraim, Manasseh, Ephraim. They'll just continue to challenge one another and create difficulties within their own borders. That they'll disintegrate from within. I don't know how many history buffs we have in the room here, but just look throughout history, and great nations generally fall not solely because somebody outside of their borders was stronger than them, but because they weakened themselves from the inside first. They devoured one another from the inside first, made themselves vulnerable and weak, and then the outside forces are able to come in and overcome them. I think that's the same imagery here at the end of the chapter. Israel was just devouring itself. Their behaviors towards one another, their oppression of the poor, their willingness to void all the moral standard of God has just created such a vile place that right under their own eyes, they're demoralizing and diminishing their own power and strength. God sending judgment, and they won't be able to stop it. They won't be able to stop it.
Ones on the outside just stand around and wait.
Right. As they weaken themselves, and ultimately God lets them in. Yep. Any thoughts about chapter 9? So keep moving with me. Chapter 10. So I think there have been so far 3 kind of passages of these woes that he's been offering. I think this is the 4th. And so he begins to describe yet another woe against the people. Verse 1. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless.
Same thing he said in chapter 5.
Yeah. The theme hasn't changed, has it, Bill? It's similar language that he used in chapter 5 and in other moments within the narrative where it kind of epitomizes a people that had become so wicked that they would prey on whom? Each other, and not just each other, but who specifically? Yeah, the widows and the fatherless. Yeah. So those who are most vulnerable among them in a society that survival in many ways depended on households, right? And generally with a father figure within that household. I mean, think about all those laws that related to the idea that if man died and his wife would become part of the family of one of his brothers, and those abilities to try to keep families from starving to death and to support one another through those challenges, they had created a society where the fatherless and the widows were vulnerable targets in order for them to go after. To me, it just is a way to epitomize how bad it had gotten, how wicked they had become, and to illustrate God's justice is right by bringing this condemnation and judgment with the people who had chosen these kinds of paths. And really that seems to be the picture that he's drawing in the text. But it's interesting, though, if you keep reading through chapter 10, that he next pauses in all his conversations about God's people, and he basically says, let me say something about Assyria for a minute as well. Because remember, they're coming from what direction? Right, they're coming from north to south, so they're coming down. And ultimately, they're going to be the ones who finalize these judgments that God is bringing, particularly against Judah. And so he pauses to make a note about them. And the problem with Assyria is they eventually begin to believe that everything God was blessing them to do came out of their what? Out of their own power. It's a reminder for all of us to stop and pause and consider that all that we have comes from God. Through the hands of a Creator and a God who cares for us and helps us. And the Assyrians had been given all kinds of blessings. And God had been using them and allowing for them to even overtake His own people to bring this kind of judgment. But there was an interesting phrase within that section that I thought kind of epitomized this. Here was how Babylon, here's how Assyria talked. He says, our princes are like kings. And that's kind of the way you could hear him say it, right? You know, even those who have lesser authorities in our kingdom are like kings in other kingdoms. Other places, these guys would be at the top of other nations. They're underlings in our nation. That's how powerful we are. That's how arrogant they had become. Our princes are like kings. And God says, I'm going to judge you for that. Verses 12 through 19, he says, they'll fulfill God's purpose and then face consequence themselves. God will allow them to finalize and finish the purposes that He establishes for them to fulfill. But He says that just like I've been bringing judgment to everyone else, you turn against me, then I'll bring judgment to you as well. Just notice verse 12. Wherefore it shall come to pass that when the Lord hath performed His whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I will punish the fruit of the stout heart of the king of Assyria and the glory of his high looks. It's interesting vernacular, right? But, you know, he wants to thumb his nose at God. He wants to look high and proud towards the throne of God. I'll let him finish the work I have in store for him. And then I'll bring judgment against him and his people as well. God will not tolerate, for lack of a better word, the pride and arrogance of anyone. And He saw it in His own people and determined to bring judgment against them. But when He saw it in the nations He was using to bring that judgment, He says, when I'm done, I'll judge them as well for the same behaviors and choices that my own people made. And that's been, the recurring theme that you see over and over and over again in the book of Isaiah. I'll pause for a moment. Thoughts, questions up to that section. So then he comes right back to the central theme. In verses 10 through 34, he just basically says there's a remnant that'll be delivered. In all this judgment and consequence and challenge that I'm bringing, ultimately, there will be a remnant that I'll preserve throughout all of those challenges. So, judgments against Israel, judgments coming against Judah, judgments coming against Assyria for their arrogance when God allowed them to have all these blessings and benefits. And ultimately, the best blessing and benefit God could provide at all is yet to come in the future, when that one born, the great king, the wonderful counselor, the Prince of Peace. Questions, anything through that section? So let me change the approach a little bit now. Because chapter 11 is about Jesus. Chapter 11 is talking about this one that would come out of what lineage? Out of who's he? That's David's father, right? Right, that's David's father. Out of the tribe of, I'm not trying to trick you, out of the tribe of Judah, okay? Jesus becomes a high priest in the New Testament, but he can't be a high priest under whom? Under Aaron, under the old law, because that's the Levites, okay? So it's interesting. God defines here that for them, this one that's coming that I've been telling you about, this wonderful counselor, this Prince of Peace, this one that would be born of a virgin, all of these prophecies concerning this one that is to come, he's not going to come from the place you think. He's not going to be just another line in the priesthood. He's going to come forth out of the rod of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with iniquity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. So, in those early verses of chapter 11, and he's talking about Jesus, he's contrasting this one that is coming to the leadership and the guidance that they had become used to. They used unrighteous means to bring judgments. They would, in our vernacular, they'd hold their finger in the air and see which way the wind was blowing, right? They'd wait to see which way the wind was blowing, and well, we better go that way because we don't want to cause trouble or resistance. He said he'll judge in a way not after the sight of his eyes. He's not going to look around and determine whether or not he should do something based on the reactions of people. He's not going to base his judgments on how people see him or perceive the circuit. None of that's relevant to this one that's going to come out of the stem of Jesse. When he arrives, righteousness reigns. When he arrives, his judgment won't be lending a hand to the wicked. His judgment will be what? He'll slay the wicked, he said, with the breath of his lips. Not with a sword and a spear, but with his what? Yeah, but what's that mean?
What he says.
What he says. His message. You think about when we think about, the Bible talks about the armor of God, and we talk about the sword of the Spirit, the word, the message that Jesus was incarnate, that word and message. So with the rod of his mouth, he's not going to lend a hand to the wicked. He's going to judge them when he arrives. This new leader that comes out of that great kingship of David, that new leader that they've been waiting for, is not the kind of men they've been witnessing throughout their nations. He's going to be far different than that. He'll bring righteousness and fair judgments, and he'll deal with the wicked rather than lending a hand to them. Righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins. When we talk about the armor of God, we say gird your loins with truth, right? In the armor of God, have your loins girded with truth. When Jesus comes, when this one that the prophet's speaking of comes, that we know to be Jesus now, when he comes, righteousness, truth, shall girdle his loins. Faithfulness, the girdle of his reins. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. And the cow and the bear shall feed, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. And the sucking child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand onto the cockatrice den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. It's interesting language, right? Because none of those things make sense, right? None of those make sense. Anybody got a snake pit you want to send your kids to? Because that's what he just said, right? Anybody got a herd of, or a flock of sheep that you want to turn some wolves loose among them? And yet, that's what he just said. He uses these interesting contrasts to help us appreciate that when the Lion of Judah arrives, he actually comes as a what? As the Lamb. That's why the Bible speaks about the lion and the lamb. He is both. He is both. Jesus is able to come on the scene with both power and compassion. He can come with judgment against the wicked and with mercy for the penitent. He's able to come in combined ways that you wouldn't necessarily think were possible. And He's able to create for those nations that would come to Him and for the people that would come to Him, those that would naturally, in most senses, be enemies of each other, are now able to come and be harmoniously together with Jesus. Keep reading for a minute and you'll see it. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people, to which shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. I think there's your definition of what he just said, by the way. To the Jew, the Gentile would be like putting a wolf and a lamb together. To a Jewish audience, to think that I'm going to have a connectivity to the Gentile world would be like sticking my hand in a snake pit, right? I think that's the imagery that he's trying to use. He's trying to get them to see that when he comes, things are going to be different. He's prepping them hundreds of years early to recognize that it's not going to be what you think it is. It's not going to be just King David's throne restored. It's going to be vastly different than that. And in ways they may have thought and felt were unimaginable. But it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set His hand again the second time to recover the remnant of His people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and Cush and Elam, from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. There'll be a remnant that gets to come back home, right? After that 70-year captivity of Judah, there's a remnant that gets to come back home. But when Jesus comes, He speaks of that as a what? I'm trying to give it to you. It's the second restoration. The first restoration is when they physically get to come back home. The second is when everybody gets to come home to Jesus. There's two remnants He has in mind here. The first remnant is those who will get the benefit of escaping all the consequence and challenges that these nations in judgment are bringing to the people. Those who are able to be exiles or captives or whatever they may be for 70 years. Zerubbabel and others will lead them back the first time for recovering the nation itself. Jesus then comes and allows a second recovery, a much larger remnant that will not just include all these Jewish folks who've been part of this heritage for all their lives, but will also include the Gentiles.
Prime shows the unity of God's purpose.
Yeah.
As He works with men of old and throughout the rest of history.
Yeah. It's interesting, it is, Gary, because you've got this wonderful blend, right, of Him speaking about contemporary things to Isaiah's time. He's talking about things that are to come in Jesus, and then He intertwines it all and helps us appreciate that God's plan is unifying from start to finish. And through Jesus, He fulfills all those things that He intended. So He'll set up an ensign, a banner, for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. But they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. They shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with His mighty wind shall He shake His hand over the river, and shall smite it in the 7 streams, and make men go over dry shod. Isaiah's prophecy is just pointing to the power and the abilities that Jesus will bring when He arrives on the scene. People that were once enemies of each other will now unify together. Those that once caused challenge and hurt towards others will have an opportunity to come together under one banner, under one flag, if you will, one ensign. And that's the purpose of Jesus. That's what He intended to do and did do and fulfilled when He comes to this world. There shall be a highway for the remnant of His people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. And so, remnant after remnant, right? And they happen in God's physical nation. It happens with Jesus and the spiritual nation that He will draw to Him from both Gentile and Jewish populaces. God brings this unifying message from the mouth of the righteous stem of Jesse to bring about these purposes that He can fulfill, just like these remnants that will come back from Assyrian captivity, just like those those folks that had become exiles from Israel that departed into various locations. And you remember when Zerubbabel and those men come back, there's a pocket of those folks come and say, "Can we be part of this?" And they had some interesting questions about that as it relates to that. Thoughts or questions you may have?
Amazing that the Pharisees used Isaiah to call John a heretic because God can't be seen. Yeah. Because it says, you cannot put before His face. Yeah. And the Pharisees were like, no, Jesus can't be moved. Right.
And yet, every ounce of evidence they'd had throughout their studious lives. And just turned completely against what had been. Yeah. Yeah. The one text that was pointing them right at what John was leading them to, and they're using it in malicious ways. It's amazing.
Leaders of the Jews, after Christ did come, they should have known who He was, but they wouldn't accept Him.
Yeah. And they had all the evidence they needed to draw the right conclusions, without question. So chapter 12 then is just a short song of praise. So we've heard the message of judgment, we've heard the message of remnants, we've heard the message of a coming Prince of Peace. And in the midst of all that then, Isaiah says, "In that day thou shalt say, O Lord, I will praise Thee. Though Thou wast angry with me, Thine anger is turned away, and Thou comforts me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. For the Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. He also is become my salvation. Therefore with joy shall ye draw water out of the wells of salvation." Jesus says, come to the waters of, what did He call them? The water of, called Himself the water of life, right? Come and take the waters of life that I freely give. It's the same imagery here that's being used. And they're singing these praises of the salvation, the wells of salvation that God is offering to those who will honor Him. "In that day shall ye say, Praise the Lord. Call upon His name. Declare His doings among the people. Make mention that His name is exalted. I think there's a song. Go ahead, Jim. I'm sorry.
It's like the Samaritan woman. She wanted that living water.
Yeah. She needed them.
Anyway, yeah. Those waters that she wouldn't have to come back day by day to the well, in her mind. It's interesting. We sing, I'm trying to think if it's in which, I get confused sometimes whether it's in the regular or the supplement, but there's a song we sing, and it talks about draw from the springs of salvation, give thanks to His great and holy name. People, praise the Lord. Never mind. I thought you'd all just chime right in with me. Apparently not. For the Lord is in our midst. That's the one I'm thinking of. It uses this very language that he's using here. Sing unto the Lord, for He hath done excellent things. This is known in all the earth. Cry out and shout, thou inhabitant of Zion, for great is the Holy One of Israel in the midst of thee. And I think that's an important kind of way for we can conclude our study tonight. That God is worthy to be praised. He's worthy to have His name exalted. Because even in the midst of judgment, even in the midst of when He has to be challenging and difficult with those who've rejected Him, He's always finding a way to collect a remnant of people that still want to serve Him. And even in the midst of some of the darkest moments of His justice against mankind, He's still offering salvation and the waters of life for any who will freely accept them. And even in those moments of judgment, His name is still worthy to be exalted and praised. Any thoughts or questions about any of that? I realize that's a big 4-chapter piece of the pie that we looked at tonight. But I think we basically got what the text said, though, as we looked at those chapters together. Next Wednesday, Lord willing, it'll be even a bigger piece, because those texts are basically the same. They're basically just telling us, here's a kingdom that gets judged, and here's what's going to happen to them, and here's a kingdom that gets judged, and here's what's going to happen to them, and we can move through that pretty quickly.